In this video, I'm going to use my brand new precision milling machine and cut fullers into the Serenity dagger blade. In the last video, we cut up our Mosaic Damascus into 35-degree angled tiles, forge welded all those tiles together, multiplying the Damascus pattern up to 130,000 layers, and then forged that out into the Serenity dagger blade. I cleaned up the blade, I cleaned up the edges, shaped the end of it just a little bit, cleaned up the tang, left a 320 grit, or a 240 grit finish rather, all over on the edges. I'm gonna soak it at 1525 for a few minutes, pull it out, and quench it in this 100-degree Parks 50. Hot in there. All right, ready? Now's the moment of truth. The blade's been soaking at 1525 for a few minutes. It's time to take it out, quickly get it in there, move it up and down to get it hardened nice and smoothly, hopefully. You need to be quick about it. Grab, pull out, quench. Not a lot of room to move it up and down because this tank is at its maximum. Okay, it's been a couple of minutes. I'm gonna take the blade out, do a little inspection. The very end of the tang is still piping hot because it didn't quite fit in there. So I need to be careful not to rub on that too much or burn myself. It's picked up a bit of a warp. I'm gonna pop it down on the surface grinder magnet. That may or may not straighten it. I did leave the blade in the oil for a long time, so it probably won't help, but it won't hurt. A lot of warp. You see that? Warped real bad right here. The blade actually looked like it had a really bad amount of warpage right here, kind of in this area. The magnet will straighten your blade sometimes if you put the blade on there while it's still pretty hot. But these days, I normally don't like doing that because if you leave the blade too hot, you can auto temper it and make the blade softer than you want. So I normally like to cool the blade down extra to make sure that I'm not gonna auto temper the blade too high of a temperature. Even then, sometimes the magnet can still straighten the blades out even if they've cooled down. Other than that, we'll have to inspect it later and see if it's warpage I can handle or not, because it was just a quick inspection looking at it.
Later.
I'll let it sit on the magnet for 15-20 minutes, see how it looks. Hopefully the magnet helped with that warpage a little bit, but if it didn't, we can handle it. Yeah, it might have helped a little bit. It's still got quite a bit of warpage right here, but nothing crazy. We'll see if it got hard. I've got a kind of worn out chainsaw file here. It should just skate right off the metal anywhere it's hard. If you use a brand new chainsaw file though, it'll kind of dig in because chainsaw files are actually made to cut into hardened chainsaw steel. Oh, that got real hard. That's excellent. Now, this is a good example of what the chainsaw file does on hard steel versus soft steel. This first portion of the tang down to about here should be rock solid, and then from here out, it should get a little bit softer. The end of the tang is still harder than it would be if you just air cooled it though, because this part of the tang was in oil. The heat was kind of sucked out a little bit quicker than if the whole blade was just out in the open air. The file's digging in really good there, and then as I go this way, it gets harder and harder and harder. I think that's gonna work beautifully. Windshield wipers. Storm. The next thing I need to do is temper this blade. Right now it's under tremendous stress. You can kind of think of it like a piece of glass. It's extremely hard, but it's also extremely brittle. We need to hit that perfect balance between hard and tough. And that's different for every knife. A kitchen knife might be harder than a big chopping bowie or an axe. And that's the same with a dagger or a sword and different things. You can tailor the hardness really based off of how you temper it. I think I'm gonna temper this at 425. I need to get it in the oven as soon as that kiln cools down. As it is, the blade just sitting around could actually crack on its own. Hopefully it doesn't have any cracks already. And if I dropped it on the concrete, even that could crack it as well. So we really wanna get it in the oven as soon as that cools down and temper it for 2 hours at 425.
2,000 years later.
I did a bunch of small things that took a lot of time on the dagger, including but not limited to staring at the steel, staring at my sketch, staring at the steel, staring at my sketch, making small adjustments. Let me take you through all the little things I did. After hardening the blade, I tempered it at 425 degrees. After tempering the blade, I surface ground the sides of it. After surface grinding the blade, I etched it in ferric chloride so I could see the pattern. After etching the steel, I could see the center of the pattern and I scribed a line right down the center of it. After scribing a center line on the blade, I used that center line to be able to clamp it up parallel in the milling machine. After clamping the blade up in the mill, I milled a little flat spot on the tip end and the tang end. Then I flipped the blade over and milled a flat spot on this side of the tip and on this side of the tang. The final thing I did was make a pattern that represents one side of the dagger blade. Now that you're caught up, let's talk about these little flat spots I made on the tang end and on the tip end. I made these as references for the center of the blade. Since this entire blade is gonna have a unique taper to it, I won't have any parallel lines that I can lay it on my granite surface with or anything. They're gonna help me do a lot of things. They're gonna help me line up this pattern of half the blade that I made. I'll be able to line it up on one side using these reference marks that I milled in, flip it over, and line it up perfectly on the other side to make both sides of the blade mirror each other. I'm also gonna be able to use them to help me lay this out on the milling machine. I'm gonna be able to lay it out, get these marks perfectly aligned with the milling machine, mill out the fuller, flip the blade over, and since I know that these are perfectly centered, I'll be able to just measure off of those again and mill the other side and know that my fullers line up beautifully on both sides. You'll also be able to do things like this. I've got my granite surface with a couple precision ground blocks of steel. I can set the ends up on it and use my height gauge to scribe center lines and scribe lines that go parallel to the center of the blade. With this pattern of half the blade, I can lay it out on the blade like this and line it up with that little flat milled section right there on each end of the blade. Clamp it in place and then scribe a line around it. And then to make the other side of the dagger blade perfectly mirror it, all I need to do is flip it over, line it up with the other side of the little flat spot I made, clamp it in place and scribe a line around this side. I've got the pattern all laid out. It's clamped on the ends. I'm gonna hold the middle down so it doesn't bow out and give myself some really deep scribe lines. I'm gonna go over it multiple times and I've got a razor sharp scribe right now. I want a nice deep marking. And I'm not totally certain this is the final shape of the pattern, but I just wanted to go ahead and lay it out on the blade and see how it all looked once I got the blade scribed in. I didn't know if maybe I needed to thin the pattern down a little bit more or something. Oh, I'm liking that. Well, I'm liking that a lot. I love this tip. Super tapery. This is probably the most tapered dagger I've ever made before with that really pokey, skinny tip. I think I like it. Now let me stare at it for a while and make sure before I grind stuff off. Coffee break. Resume staring. Before I fire up the mill, I want to tell you about the exclusive deal we've got going on right now with the Beginner Bladesmith online course. Are you a beginner knife maker who wants to learn the skills to make better knives? Then you may be interested in our online course made for makers like you. It's called the Beginner Bladesmith. In this course, I take you from start to finish, leaving nothing out on how to make an elegant, everyday carry knife. We videoed this course in a way that makes you feel like you're in my shop learning from me one-on-one. So join the course today because we're having an exclusive 40% discount for anyone who clicks the link in the description. We're confident that you'll love this course, and if you don't, we'll give you a full refund within 30 days of purchasing it. So click the link in the description to redeem your 40% discount.
This offer will not last long.
And now back to our weekly broadcast. I'm gonna take this over the 2x72 and start cleaning up the profile of this blade. I do need to be careful at the tip because I don't want to completely follow my scribe lines and grind it all the way to a tip. I would be getting rid of these nice little flat reference marks. So right here out towards the tip, I'm gonna leave that extra bulky and just profile the rest of the blade. Leave like the last inch, inch and a half alone. I wanna avoid the grinder leaving any color in the blade and keep it below the temperature that colors start to form, which seems to be around 350, 400 degrees Fahrenheit. I definitely don't want to get any blue colors or anything like that, or the temper has been ruined in that spot. Technically, a little bit of straw color wouldn't hurt, but I want to avoid that too. I really enjoy this Travis Schwartz signature platen because it has a little dial indicator and a knob you can turn that angles the platen attachment and makes it so it's easy to dial in a perfect 90-degree angle between the platen and the work rest. The blade is now profiled. We've got the tip, which is gonna come later, and we've also got the ricasso and tang, which again, I'll be doing later. The next thing I've been working on is how to mill in the fuller on the blade. I've done it a couple different ways in the past, and the design for this knife was actually gonna have a main fuller going down the center of the blade and little tiny fullers off to the sides of it, or a little bit smaller fullers to the sides of the main one on the ricasso only. I did a bunch of practice on this piece of mild steel here. I milled in little sections of fuller, and then I went over to the grinder and ground the blade like it would be on the real dagger, and then did another section, messed around with different widths of cuts, different depths of cuts, and nothing was coming out quite how I wanted it. So I'm not gonna do these side cuts right now. I think it'll work out better with some kind of a deep hollow ground blade, but it's not gonna work with the flat grind that I wanna do on this dagger. We are gonna still do the main fuller down the center. So I also figured out the depth I wanna go for that. We're gonna go with a 1/4 inch carbide ball end mill bit, and I'm gonna go 40 thousandths of an inch deep. Because I'm getting rid of those side fullers, I also redesigned the ricasso on my dagger just a little bit, changed up the shape of it to more accommodate the single fuller going down the middle of the blade. To mill in this fuller, I'm gonna use our brand new massive Precision Grizzly mill we just got. This thing has been in the shop for a couple months, haven't really had a chance to set it up and use it yet. Dad's been working on getting it set up, and it's finally in a state where we can use it pretty much for the first serious time. I'm really excited about this milling machine. It should be a tremendous jump up from the other Grizzly mill we have. We'll still end up using it, especially for rough stuff, but what makes this mill so nice is it has a much higher end bearing in it for the spindles, so everything should be tighter. It is also variable speed, which is gonna be amazing because I cannot tell you how annoying it was to change the speed on the other one. It had step pulleys up here in this like cast iron casing, and it was a pain to change the speed sometimes. And you could actually cut your hands up on that sharp casing. Don't worry, just catch up. But with this, we've got variable speed. You got a high and a low range, and all the way up to 50,000 RPM. 5,000 RPM rather, not 50. It also has a nice big table on it so we can do longer projects or have more tooling set up on the table at the same time, like maybe have a vise set up here and a rotary table set up here. Everything is just bigger and beefier, and that a lot of times translates to more precision. Things don't move around as much. So I'm super excited to try this out. I've got the blade all clamped up in the milling machine. This took me quite a while to get it all clamped up how I wanted, but I think we're there. If you remember back, I made these little parallel milled sections on the very tips of the blade that represent the very center of the blade. They're gonna be our reference marks for the center. Well, part of why I wanted to do that was so we could use those to locate the blade in the mill. I clamped these parallel jaws down and got them lined up perfectly with the milling machine within like a 1/2,000th of an inch. The next thing I did was use this edge finder right here on the tang end. I found the edge of this center area, did a little math, moved the mill over to be right in the middle of that, and now the mill should be about as close as I can possibly get it to the center of the blade. And what's nice about having these stops on here, now that everything's set up, I should be able to just mill in this side, unclamp the blade, flip it over, and mill in the other side, and the fullers should be very, very close to being lined up with each other. Here we go. First official milling operation on the new mill for me. I'm gonna start right here. I'm gonna crank the speed up to maximum. Everything good? Everything locked that needs to be?
5,000 RPM for this ball end cutter seems to be really nice. And since this mill is so big and beefy, everything feels extra smooth and creamy, which is what you want. Anytime things are kind of wiggling or moving around as you're milling, it can cause things to chatter and cause your mill bit to break or chip off a lot more. So immediately I'm feeling like this mill's quite a bit more stiff and sturdy. I'm doing two things with this fuller I've never done before. The first thing I'm doing is letting the fuller run all the way out to the tip, and then when I grind the blade in and grind the distal taper, the fuller will come to a super fine point. Where that point stops on the blade will be determined by how much grinding I do and by how deep I make the fuller. The second thing I'm going to do is actually have the fuller run underneath the guard instead of stopping short of the guard, and there'll actually be a little gap where the fuller just disappears underneath there. After I cut in the fuller on one side, I flip the blade over and begin lining everything up and cut the second side in.
I just finished milling in the fullers. The new mill worked amazingly. It's so much bigger and beefier and more solid. It felt smooth and creamy as I was doing all that milling, and having the ability to turn the mill up to 5,000 RPM I think was really nice for this. The next thing I want to do is get the majority of the hand sanding done on this fuller. The reason being, anytime you're hand sanding something like a fuller, you're going to be rounding over these corners just a little bit. I'd rather round them over now, then grind the bevels in later. And when I grind those bevels in, it'll crisp up all those corners again. To sand this fuller, I'm gonna be using a technique I discovered last time I did a fuller, and that is to wrap a piece of sandpaper around a long flexible rod and then stick it in the drill and hand sand the fuller that way. It turns out it's way easier and quicker than sitting there with a little rod with a piece of sandpaper wrapped around it, pushing it manually.
The idea to have a rod with a slit on the end and sandpaper wrapped around it is actually inspired by some hand sanding I saw my dad doing in the shop. Before this method, I would take an angled round rod and just hold a piece of sandpaper on it and then sit there and start sanding the fuller manually. That method worked okay, except it took a long time, and it was extra difficult at the end where the fuller stops to get everything cleaned up. You kind of had to do this weird flicking motion to sand where the fuller starts and stops.
That looks kind of like confetti. I've actually got a bunch of these little pieces that really look like confetti. Whee! Woo! This gives me an idea. I wonder if we could sell knife maker confetti.
Are you a sad knife maker who struggles with being happy? Introducing Knife Maker's Confetti, the confetti that will make any knife maker happy again. You just grab it and throw it in the air. It's that easy.
If you are using or plan on using any other kind of confetti while using Knife Maker's Confetti, check with your doctor first. High dosage may cause mental problems. Wear safety glasses while using Knife Maker's Confetti. Studies have shown large amounts of milling burrs in the Knife Maker's Confetti, and some have reported serious injury to the eye and even blindness. Knife Maker's Confetti is known to cause cancer and even death in the state of California.
So call and order the Knife Maker's Confetti jar today for just $9.99. But call right now and we'll send you a second jar as a bonus.
Plus additional shipping and handling.
That's 2 Knife Maker's Confetti jars for the unbelievably low price of just $9.99. Order now.
I am done sanding on the fuller. That ended up taking quite a bit of time, even using the round rod on the drill. The high-speed drill did not work, by the way. I had to stop a lot and rip off little pieces of paper, and that high-speed drill took forever to slow down and everything, and it was a little bit excessive, so I went back to the battery-powered drill that was lower RPM. The fuller looks really nice though. I took it all the way up to 2,500 grit. I'm planning on barely doing any sanding on this later on. I'll probably just clean up things a little bit after the blade is all ground and hand sanded right before we etch it in ferric chloride, and that'll be it. As I work on the rest of the dagger though, I need to make sure that I don't let the fuller like rust or anything, because that would be bad. I'd have to go backwards grits and do a bunch of sanding and everything after the blade was all ground, so I do need to keep a close eye on that. I would say overall using the drill with the rod and sandpaper on the end was still quite a bit faster than hand sanding this by hand with a little rod and just pushing it back and forward down in that groove.
In the next video, this dagger is going to start looking like a dagger because we're going to be grinding in the blade bevels.
I will see you in the next video. May the forge be with you. Bye-bye.
The YouTube algorithm thinks you'll like this video, so let's see if it's right. I think you'll like this video, so let's see if I'm right.